Hi everyone, welcome to this debate, and thanks so much for coming, and thanks so much to our speakers, who Sophie will introduce properly. So this is the Christ College Two Cultures debate, Milton versus Darwin, and we've arranged this in celebration of Milton's, the 350th anniversary of Milton's death. And this is part of a range of things that we've been organising in the college to celebrate that, which include a redesign of our study site, Darkness Visible. And this isn't finished, but this is kind of part of the design work that various students have been working on towards that. And thank you so much to those students. We've also been working on a film about Milton's mulberry tree, which we have in the college. Well, the so-called Milton's mulberry tree, as the film will investigate. So the concept of the debate also pays tribute to another alumnus, C.P. Snow's idea of the two cultures, so the divide between the sciences and the arts. So we're kind of playing into that divide by pitting Milton and Darwin against each other. But I think we'll find lots of connections between the two tonight. Darwin was very influenced and inspired by Milton in his writings and on his voyages, so I think Milton already arguably has the upper hand. Can you tell whose side I'm on? Can I ask, please, people to turn off their phones or put them on silent or airplane mode, because we're going to be recording this. There'll be drinks downstairs in the function room afterwards. And we've got a wonderful bookstall from Waterstones here selling copies of our speakers' books, including two that are brand new. So that's very exciting. So please do have a look at that afterwards. Now I'll hand over to another fellow in English here, Sophie Read, to compare the debate.
Katie, thank you very much. Am I holding this in the right place, everyone? I know it's more or less near my face, but yeah, okay, good. You can hear me at the back. Fantastic. All right, so I'm really excited to be comparing this debate, which I've been sold as a kind of interdisciplinary face-off. So Katie's version of this debate was very collegial and decorous, and I'm hoping for something a little bit more gloves off than that, but we'll see. It'll be very exciting anyway. I don't have much of a job here. All I'm going to do really is introduce the speakers out of order, just to keep you on your toes and to make sure you're paying attention, and to keep them to time. So my other great function here is to make sure everyone only speaks for 10 minutes, which I will do with a variety of kind of facial gestures, probably gestures with my hands, also maybe physical intervention if it really gets ridiculous, but I hope it won't. Perhaps some pantomime watch tapping before any of those things are necessary. Those are my only functions. One thing I want to do before we start this debate, and I might have something else to do when we get to the end, is to ask, whose side are you on at this stage? So can I ask everybody in this room to put up your hands when I say one of two names, okay? You can guess which ones they're going to be. So first of all, if you are already, without having heard any of what people have to say, Team Darwin, can you put up your hands, please? Okay, that's 4 of you. That's great. Those of you who are Team Milton, could you now raise your hands? Okay, well, that is right. That's I think okay, five or 6. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. We will see if anybody has managed to change your mind at the end of this debate. Obviously, I highly doubt it, but you never know, and it'll be interesting to find out. Okay. As I say, the last from me, I'll just introduce the speakers. If things get very heated, I will intervene if there are any kind of trading of blows or personal insults. Otherwise, I will leave everybody to it. So first of all, Team Milton, sitting here to my left. The first to speak for Team Milton will be Professor Colin Burrow, a professor of Renaissance literature who has a particular interest in the classics and classical inheritance of early modern writing. Colin is late of this parish. Does that mean died? No, I'm sorry. I mean, he used to be here. Apologies. He was a fellow of Keys for many years. and a member of the Faculty of English. He's now a senior research fellow at All Souls College, Oxford, and author of many wonderful books, including Epic Romance, which is about Spenser and Milton too, as well as books on Shakespeare and Ben Jonson and many, many other exciting and fabulous things. Colin's also literary critic for the LRB, in which capacity he has been recording really brilliant, fabulous, witty, sharp, funny and fine podcasts with his colleague Claire Bucknell on the subject of satire, which I listen to by way of research, and I can recommend them. They are brilliant. He tells me, personal communication, we were described in the Financial Times as the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers of literary studies. I have accepted that I am Ginger. This communication was followed by a kind of half promise to dance. It was worth a try, I think you'll agree. Okay, so the second person to speak for Team Milton, who will in fact be speaking third, you see I said I was going to test you on how much attention you were paying, is Orlando Reade, who is author of a very exciting forthcoming book on our book table, What in Me is Dark, The Revolutionary Life of Paradise Lost. This, I thought, was out next Thursday. The publication date that Penguin seemed to be suggesting is less than a week, but you have advanced copies here, so it's super hot off the press, super exciting. Orlando was an undergraduate here at St John's, I think. In fact, I think I taught you, Orlando, didn't I? But luckily, has had no impact. Before undertaking doctoral work in Princeton in the States, he's currently an assistant professor at Northeastern University in London. He taught in some prisons as well as some universities over in the States, and perhaps we can investigate what the similarities are. I think we can all work out the differences. And some of that has gone into this new book, The Revolutionary Life of Paradise Lost, where he explores through unexpected readers, people like Malcolm X, Virginia Woolf, Hannah Arendt, what the meaning of Paradise Lost is. So that, as I say, on the book table, just out, hot off the press. So for Team Darwin, we have some very eminent speakers to my right. And the first person who's going to speak is Professor David Norman, Christ's own paleontologist and professor of natural sciences. He will need little introduction for most of you here. David, recently retired, is a paleobiologist, in fact, I have been told, corrected, which apparently means that he studies fossils and the evolution of life on Earth. And what it seems to mean is an awful lot of thinking about dinosaurs. It's brilliant. Dinosaur bones, dinosaur heads, dinosaur fossils, other dinosaur bits. Dinosaur, I don't want to lower the tone. Brains, okay, dinosaur brains, fantastic. He's a former director of the Sedgwick Museum in Cambridge. If you haven't been, you must go. It's an absolute gem. It's brilliant. It's got lots of fine and interesting things. It's a lovely building. Please go to that. And he was also responsible for setting up the Charles Darwin Galapagos Islands Trust Fund, which is administered by Christ's in collaboration with the Galapagos Conservation Trust, and it supports educational projects, including funding some JRF's Junior Research Fellowships here at Christ's. The final speaker for Team Darwin will be Ruth Padel, who is an award-winning poet and the great-great-granddaughter of Darwin. Ruth, is that enough greats?
That's plenty.
That's exactly the number of great. Good, okay. We're really delighted in particular to welcome Ruth back to Christ. She had a Leverhulme Fellowship here in 2009 and did brilliant work then. Ruth read classics at Oxford and has written a number of important critical books, actually, as well as her poetry, including the fabulous Whom Gods Destroy, which was on madness in Greek tragedy. Those of you I've taught for tragedy will be familiar with this work. Ruth has taught and lived all over the world, as far as I can make out from her biography, and now best known as a poet and writer. Her beautiful lyrical work often deals with questions of the natural world, addresses climate change and migration and things like that, as well as, surprisingly and brilliantly, genetics and zoology, and you may be able to have a kind of sense of where that interest comes from. Ruth is currently teaching for the Royal Literary Fund at Magdalen, and her new collection of poems, Girl, has been published this week and is also on the book table, just getting in there ahead of Orlando in the publishing schedules, I think by just a few days, but they're both there and I commend them to you. Without, as they say, further ado, that's a lot of ado, I'm sorry, probably too much ado. Anyway, there'll be no more ado, and we're going to move straight on to the debate. So first of all, I will ask Colin to speak for strictly 10 minutes, with perhaps a little allowance if we go over, and then I will hand over to David. Okay, so Colin, please, can you begin?
I shall begin. I may lose my voice. If I lose it completely, Milton wins, okay? That's the deal. I thought I'd start off by contrasting Milton and Darwin's rather different undergraduate careers at this college. So in 1642, Milton wrote a work snappily entitled An Apology Against a Pamphlet called a Modest Confutation of the Animadversions upon the Remonstrant against Smectymnuus. I hope you're taking notes. The Apology for short. In that work, he responded to allegations that he'd spent his undergraduate career in brothels, and perhaps even worse than that, going to plays. It's natural, he says, that he would have picked up some dirty thoughts and some understanding of drama while at Cambridge, because his fellow undergraduates were all filthy thesps. When in the college so many of the young divines and those in next aptitude to divinity have been seen so oft upon the stage, writhing and unboning their clergy limbs to all the antic and dishonest gestures of trinculos, buffoons and bawds, prostituting the shame of that ministry which either they had or were nigh having to the eyes of courtiers and court ladies with their grooms and mademoiselles, there while they acted and overacted among other young scholars, I was a spectator. They thought themselves gallant men, I thought them fools. That is how to get popular as an undergraduate at Cambridge. And Milton goes on to say that he didn't go to brothels and plays, and long it was not after, when I was confirmed in this opinion, that he who would not be frustrate of his hope to write well hereafter in laudable things, ought himself to be a true poem, that is, a composition and pattern of the best and honourablest things. So that is what Christ's did for the man known as the Lady of Christ's. It made him a fantastic prig, or perhaps a true poem, or perhaps a bit of both. Contrast Darwin's experience in Cambridge. Although, as we shall presently see, there were some redeeming features in my life at Cambridge, my time was sadly wasted there, and worse than wasted, from my passion for shooting and for hunting, and when this failed, for riding across country, I got into a sporting set, including some dissipated, low-minded young men. We used often to dine together in the evening, though these dinners often included men of a higher stamp, and we sometimes drank too much, with jolly singing and playing at cards afterwards. I know that I ought to feel ashamed of days and evenings thus spent, but as some of my friends were very pleasant and we were all in the highest spirits, I cannot help looking back to these times with much pleasure. And Darwin also relates that he practiced shooting with blanks in his college rooms, to the consternation of the fellows of the college. The explosion of the cap caused a sharp crack, and I was told that the tutor of the college remarked, "What an extraordinary thing it is! Mr. Darwin seems to spend hours in cracking a horsewhip in his room, for I often hear the crack when I pass under his windows." So that's our choice this evening, basically. Would you rather have a laddish, hunting, shooting idler of an undergraduate, Darwin, or a very virtuous prig? I love prigs. Vote for prigs. But I suppose there is more to this debate than the contrast between their undergraduate careers. It's a debate, obviously, which could degenerate into a rather fruitless bit of mud wrestling in which the evolutionist Darwin is pitted against the creationist Milton. And I suppose that's how the debate would play out if we were in, I don't know, Tennessee or Arkansas or somewhere like that. Milton was a creationist. He did believe that the world was created by God. But actually, by the time he wrote Paradise Lost in the 1660s, he was a kind of early modern evolutionist. And his view of evolution was, in my view, morally preferable to Darwin's. And to explain this, I need to give a very short account of a highly technical area, which is Milton's understanding of what matter was. Now, crudely put, Milton came to believe that matter and spirit were not essentially distinct, but that spirit was a kind of hyper-refined matter. It was therefore possible for material beings to evolve, as it were, by becoming increasingly spiritualized. And he also believed that the whole created world derived from first matter, which may even have pre-existed the creation, and that creation was not ex nihilo, but from nothing, but ex deo, from God. So in technical language, he was what has been called an animist materialist, who thought that matter and spirit were one thing, but that spirit was a refined and glorified version of matter, and all of this was ultimately from God. Now that meant that Milton wasn't a simple creationist for whom God created fixed and distinct species which remained forever the same. He actually believed that the whole created world occupied a sliding scale from pure matter, stuff like rocks and so on, to rational beings like mankind and super-rational beings like the angels, and that given the right circumstances, material things could become spirit or move up the scale of being and become more like God himself, more purely spiritual. Now that sounds all weird and abstract, but Milton, in his way, was as practical and as worldly as the gun-toting Darwin. Indeed, the main place in which Milton set out this vision of the world could not be more down to earth, because in Book 5 of Paradise Lost, the angel Raphael visits Adam and Eve to warn them that Satan wants them to fall. And, of course, angels are spiritual beings, but it's lunchtime, and Raphael's hungry, and Adam wants to know, understandably, how it's possible for a spiritual being like an angel to eat lunch, material objects, figs and stuff, and apples, and still be spiritual. And this leads Raphael to explain how matter can gradually evolve into spirit in one of the most wonderful passages of poetry ever written in English. O Adam, one Almighty is, from whom all things proceed, and up to him return, if not depraved from good. Created all such to perfection, one first matter all, endued with various forms and various degrees of substance, and in things that live of life, but more refined, more spirituous and pure, as nearer to him placed and nearer tending, each in their several active spheres assigned, till body up to spirit work in bounds proportioned to each kind. So from the root springs lighter the green stalk, from thence the leaves more airy, last the bright consummate flower spirits odorous breathes. Flowers and their fruit, man's nourishment by gradual scale sublime, to vital spirits aspire, to animal, to intellectual, give both life and sense, fancy and understanding, whence the soul reason receives, and reason is her being. Wonder not then what God for you saw good, if I refuse not, but convert as you to proper substance. Time may come when men with angels may participate, and find no inconvenient diet, nor too light fare, and from these corporal nutriments perhaps your bodies may at last turn all to spirit, improved by tract of time, and winged ascend, ethereal as we, or may at choice here or in heavenly paradises dwell. Now, I suppose only Milton could have written a preprandial speech which was quite so metaphysically complex. But Raphael is setting out an evolutionary view of the world in which matter is aspiring continually to the condition of spirit. To state the blindingly obvious, that's very, very different from Darwin's view of the world, in which, as Darwin put it, species and groups of species have tried to overmaster other species in the great battle for life. Milton's got no natural selection, true, but there's also no violence. There's just endless aspiration from matter to spirit, in which material entities seek to return to the condition of Godhead from which they ultimately derive. Now, okay, you might be saying, that's fine. It might even be beautiful, but it's not true, is it? So why should we bother with it? Well, I think there is a larger question here. Why should we read works like Paradise Lost, which exhaustively set out views of the world that probably aren't true? Well, with one's contemporaries, there's an obvious social benefit in being willing to listen to points of view with which one doesn't agree. Indeed, living in a pluralistic society more or less requires that of its citizens, and family Christmas lunches would be unbearable without that basic form of intellectual toleration. But attempting to understand an internally coherent view of reality from an entirely different age, which is founded on completely alien principles from us, is really something different. It is an exercise in utopian imagining, how the world could be. And I think Milton asks you a series of questions. What would it mean to think of yourself as being made of the same stuff as elephants and angels and stones and the grass and the winds and the seas? How would that change our view of the world? How would it change our relationship to the environment? what if the task of the world was not just to engage in what Darwin calls the great battle for life, but was instead to work towards a more rational and spiritual state of being? And the biggest question of all, with which I will conclude, so you can stop tapping your watch, is this. Isn't Milton's world, in which matter aspires to evolve into spirit, morally preferable and better to live in than the grubby, competitive, post-Darwinist world that we presently inhabit?
Thank you very much, Colin, and a fabulous slender 11 minutes. Well done. Now over to Professor David Norman, who is cheating, as you can see, with a PowerPoint. This was not part of the brief.
5 points.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we won't need to, but in any case, 10 minutes, David, starting from now.
Thank you, Sophie. I too have a voice problem. I hope I don't die on you. I'd like to try and sort of put Darwin into context. We've had an oration by Colin, which has given us a sort of moral versus a sort of harsh view of the world. I just want to put Darwin into context and sort of try and understand how, to some extent, he was inspired by a need to understand the world of Milton and others, and how, in fact, I could make the case that he grew beyond that. So let's see how we go. So Darwin was a student at Christ's, and I got one of my undergraduate students to make a bronze statue of him, which you can see in Newcourt. I've chosen a moment. Anthony and I put together the idea that Darwin, in May 1831, was at a pivotal point in his life. He had come to Christ's on the understanding he would do an ordinary degree, and on the basis of that would then be able to take holy orders and join the church. There was a logic and a reason for that, as I'll explain. But the trouble was, in a sense, he was too good. He rapidly completed his ordinary degree by January 1831. And to complete his terms of residence, he had to stick in Cambridge for another 2 terms. So Lent and Easter had to be occupied. And if you read his biography literally, as Colin has done, you'd think he was womanizing, going to Newmarket for the races, having a totally dissipated life. He wasn't. He was actually running a rather different and rather interesting life. He was self-deprecating when he was writing his autobiography. So the Darwin family had a history. It had a rather interesting history because the grandfather, Erasmus, was a multi-skilled medical practitioner. He'd trained in Edinburgh, but he became a financier, and also he became one of the leaders of what are called the Lunar Men. So in the middle of the 18th century, he and James Watt and Matthew Boulton and Joseph Priestley, people who were going to fire the Industrial Revolution, were meeting on the outskirts of Birmingham on the night of the full moon, so the carriages could get home safely. And these rather gifted people were extremely important at that time in the central West Midlands. Amongst them, Erasmus was multi-talented. Not only was he a GP, but he also was extremely interested in natural history and wrote a series of interesting and fascinating poetic accounts of the world, of the earth, of nature and society in succession, in which he not only had this amazing poetic skill, but also was actually very deeply understanding of our understanding of the earth, of nature and society. He was a very keen botanist, and that's a pervasive theme. And within the arguments that he was developing, particularly in the book Zoonomia, he actually indicated his understanding that organisms could have evolved over time and that species were more flexible than one would currently understand them to be if you took the literal biblical creation of species as a story that was true. And his version of organic evolution, it's this so-called transmutation at the time, was rather Lamarckian in principle. I don't need to discuss that, but he was hinting at evolution, even at that stage, at the beginning, right at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. He died just before Darwin was born. So, Darwin, as a young man, was rather interesting to his father. His father himself was a medic as well, had a GP practice, and took his son on his tour of patients and noticed that Charles was very sensitive. He was observant, he was sensitive, and would make clearly a very good doctor. He just had those natural sympathetic skills. So as in the case of Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather, and Robert, Charles's father, he went to Edinburgh. Charles was sent to Edinburgh at the age of 16. He was doing very poorly at Shrewsbury School and was yanked out of school and sent there because his elder brother, Erasmus, was 5 years older and already at Edinburgh. He himself had been at Christ's and was finishing off his degree course in medicine in Edinburgh. So elder brother could look after younger brother. So he went to Edinburgh and spent 2 years there. The trouble was that the sympathetic Charles Darwin was revolted by the style of teaching that was going on there. In particular, open surgery meant that he had to sit in classes where people were operated upon with no anaesthetic. So there was blood, gore, screaming, and in no time he found that he just couldn't stomach that. So he spent time away from classes, formal classes in medicine, and went actually to lectures in natural history and geology, and spent time with Robert Grant working on the marine fauna of the Firth of Forth. Eventually, the sisters blew the whistle. Father learned that Charles was not going to graduate in medicine because he was not attending classes. So, what to do? The problem was the family was relatively wealthy, and the children knew it, and in fact, they didn't need to work. They could have sustained themselves on the family income. But Robert, the father, wanted Darwin to actually do something with his life. So, he's genuinely, I want you to have a worthwhile career. I want a respectable position in society. I don't want you to be a wastrel. What to do? How could we use this interest, this personal enthusiasm that you've got, which you've inherited from your grandfather, its interest in bossy and natural history generally, to good purposes? Well, the solution was yank him out of Edinburgh and send him to Cambridge. Either Cambridge or Oxford would provide you with an ordinary degree that would allow you to take holy orders. Ideal. It meant that he could have a safe career in a parish, and the temptation to do that, if you could take holy orders after you'd finished your degree in Oxford or Cambridge, was that there was the example of Gilbert White, the vicar of Selborne, who'd written the natural history of Selborne while he was a vicar of the parish, which meant that he could look after his parishioners, but he had plenty of free time around the sermonising that he was doing to look at natural history. And he wrote a bestseller on the natural histories. Ideal. This would suit Darwin down to the ground. He could become a cleric, and he could do plenty of his hobby in his spare time. Perfect. Where to go? St John's, obviously. That's the academic Cambridge connection between the Darwin family and Cambridge. Too academic. Easygoing Christ's is the place to go for sportsmen and people of a dissipated background, perhaps. So he was signed up to do holy orders, to do an ordinary degree so that he could take holy orders and become a clergyman. And the prospect of continuing with his hobby was just perfect. And so it was about to transpire. Christ's was fortunate in the sense of the clerical potential that Darwin had, because not only was John Milton here, but also William Paley. William Paley was particularly important because he'd written a book called Natural Theology, used all the way through Cambridge, even into the early 20th century. And basically it was an exposition that proved, as far as was possible, that God, the creator and architect, had created the solar system the structure of the earth, and all the species that were in it. It was the watchmaker argument. The life is so complex, organisms are so complex, the eye is so complex that as if you found a watch on a heath and you picked up the pocket watch and looked at the complexity, you know that somebody had to make it. When you looked at the complexity of something like an orchid or the structure of an eye, it's so complicated and integrated, somebody must have designed it. This line of argumentation really appealed to Darwin. He liked the clarity of the argument. He liked the fact that Paley himself was a very good natural historian. And he also liked the fact that he thought he was in the rooms that were occupied by Paley. That was the folklore at the time. So it's very appealing. So that was a profound influence. So Paley became an important component of the 2 years that he spent doing his ordinary degree. Erasmus Darwin was important because of the poetic expositions on the structure of nature, which came from a deep understanding of natural philosophy. And then Milton's Paradise Lost was just a fantastic, epic, plain verse, blank verse poem of the Christian myth of the fall and redemption of mankind. These were obvious, in a sense, waymarks on the gradual transition of Darwin in order for him to accept the articles of faith and take holy orders. He was absolutely set to become a clergyman. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the 2 terms that he had spare, because he finished his ordinary degree in January 31, were not spent with a dissipated lifestyle. He might have enjoyed himself as an undergraduate to some extent, but he became adopted by John Henslow. John Henslow was one of a number of really talented academics that were being acquired by Cambridge. In the previous century, Cambridge was a waste of space. It was a place where you could prepare gentlemen for later life or for the church. It was a finishing school and no more. It wasn't an intellectual powerhouse. At some time during the early part of the 19th century, people like Henslow, a polymath, a cleric, John Herschel, future astronomer royal, Adam Sedgwick, the geologist, Charles Babbage, the inventor of the difference engine, the moral philosopher William Whewell, Peacock, George Peacock, George Biddle Airy, these fantastically talented people who are going to become the greats of the Victorian era were meeting on a regular basis with John Henslow. And if you're a lucky undergraduate, you could actually listen in to their discussions. Darwin was part of that. And he was, in a sense, adopted by John Henslow. And I think Henslow, as a great gifted teacher, saw something. You wouldn't spend time with somebody like Darwin if he was that dissipated. It was not true. He had something that the teacher spotted. He spent time with him, and then timing was everything. Darwin ended up, as you know, on the voyage of the Beagle, but George Peacock, that connection through Trinity, was asked by the government to find a companion for the captain of the Beagle, Robert Fitzroy, and the obvious choice was John Henslow. Henslow, in his late 20s, young family, a wife said, no, no way. Second choice, Leonard Jennings, a curate in Bottisham, a good natural historian, young wife, young family, no way. Third choice, well, there's this chap Darwin. Henslow had introduced him to a number of scientific disciplines. He'd taught him to read Herschel's work on a discourse on natural philosophy. He'd prepared Darwin as well as he could to become a natural philosopher rather than somebody intended for the church. He'd opened his mind to ways of thinking, and in particular, a sort of a deductive type of approach to science. And in the end, obviously, Darwin joined Robert Fitzroy, who was a Christian, a God-fearing Christian. And no doubt, in the early phases of the voyage, Darwin really enjoyed Paley, he really enjoyed Milton, he really enjoyed the poetic. And he would have enjoyed the discussions that he would have had with the God-fearing Fitzroy. But in essence, what he was given, because of Henslow, was an opportunity to do a thesis, your subject is the world, and you've got 5 years to complete it. And boy, did he complete it. Henslow, as I say, had prepared Darwin. He'd given him the inductive skills to explain observations and develop theories from those observations on a global scale. The natural philosophy that was taught was holistic. It was integrated what we would call science, all the different disciplines together. There wasn't a distinction between geology and chemistry and cell biology, and etc. It was all part of a unified view. Darwin's contributions to natural sciences, physical, enormous. Petrology, seismology, volcanology, stratigraphy, paleontology, oceanography. He has absolutely, if he hadn't written that damn book, Origin of Species, he would be famous because of his physical, geological contributions. In the natural sciences, he developed all these other areas of science, which have become individual disciplines themselves, which were expanded in the books he produced after The Origin of Species. He was a truly remarkable person. Don't believe his autobiography. He had a lot of native intelligence, which was built on by some remarkable people. I would love to know who recruited these academics at the beginning of the 19th century, because Trinity and St John's made a huge difference to what Cambridge is now. Without them, Cambridge wouldn't be that academic powerhouse that it is within the area of the natural sciences. In later life, Darwin regretted. He felt he'd lost something. His mind, as he said, had become...
Sadly, that's all we've got time for.
He ran out facts which allowed him to develop theories which could then be tested on occasion. He also regretted, as he said, an appreciation of the poetic and the romantic. He found that he'd moved on from his understanding of poetry and the writings of Milton, for example, as a comfortable environment to one where actually data could be used and developed. So what I'm suggesting is that the Miltonian phase, or at least the phase that was influenced by people like John Milton, was an important part of his ontogeny. He was growing up through this process, but he moved beyond it to the rational, because he was then using real data to test and observe the way in which life and the universe, to some extent, has evolved over time. He was pilloried by some of his teachers. Henslow never accepted Darwin's theory of evolution. Sedgwick never accepted his theory of evolution. Even Herschel had doubts about the mechanistic nature of it and whether there was actually a design component in there somewhere. He didn't, and this was an establishment view, they didn't like the mechanical side of the process of natural selection and evolution within the context of, as Colin would have said, the battle between species. And on that interesting note,
Thank you very much. A truly Miltonic 10 minutes. Orlando, I'll hand over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to try and stick to my 10.
You've only got 5. I'm joking, it's 10.
Today, many people are suspicious about claims about greatness, perceiving these to be connected to old-fashioned hierarchies. However, the question of which are the most important writers and which are the most important books to read is one that I suggest remains highly important for us, those of us who read. And in the time I have today, I'm going to argue that Paradise Lost is a text that we need more than any one of Darwin's books. I should acknowledge that Milton, like Darwin, got many things wrong. But I'm going to argue that poets, unlike scientists, are allowed to be wrong. Since this hasn't been covered already, and I thought it might, I want to give you 3 facts very quickly, 3 reasons why Milton is an extraordinary person. Firstly, he was a radical who championed many important freedoms that we take for granted today. The freedom of the press, the right to get divorced if you're married to someone incompatible, the right to depose your ruler if they become a tyrant. He was one of the godfathers of the modern liberal tradition. And he defended these positions at a time when it was highly unpopular, and he was taunted and attacked and ultimately imprisoned for these views. So any of us who cherish those liberal democratic freedoms should be grateful to Milton for that. Secondly, he wrote Paradise Lost, an epic poem, 10,500 lines long, while he was blind and couldn't see a single page of that poem. This extraordinary, sprawling, intricate, but exacting poem about the origins and entire history of humankind. And I think this ranks as one of the most extraordinary achievements in world literature. So I just want to establish that as a key fact for your consideration. The third reason why he's extraordinary is the afterlife of his political ideas and his poetry. He went on to influence the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams. All adored Milton. Jefferson seemingly echoes Milton when he says, "It is a truth we hold to be self-evident that all men are created equal." Paradise Lost went on to become an important part of a revolutionary tradition taken up by people not only in America, but also in France, in Haiti, in Cuba, in Egypt. And I don't think there's another writer, perhaps not even Shakespeare, who can claim to have been such an important part of the modern political tradition. And not only that, but among literary writers from George Eliot to Virginia Woolf, Milton was someone they viewed as unignorable. But for the rest of the time that I have today, I want to make an argument about how Milton, even as he was wrong, still produced a poem that has an enduring claim on literary truth. Milton viewed Paradise Lost as an inspired poem. He believed that it was given to him by a divine muse at night time, and he dictated it in the mornings. He saw its contents, therefore, as being true, although not strictly speaking accurate. While he did believe that we are all descended from Adam and Eve, nevertheless, he knew that the speeches he wrote for them as they bicker with each other after the fall were not factually accurate, but they were probable. This is a term from Aristotle, meaning this is how a reader, an audience, could believe that someone would have acted if they were in this position. And Darwin admired Paradise Lost for what he saw as its human truth when he was doing his research into the human emotions. He went to Paradise Lost as a repository of truth, no less than scientific truth. So whilst Paradise Lost is not necessarily factual, I suggest it is a repository of its own kind of truth. He doesn't have to be a scientist in order to produce something that's enduringly true, and true in a poetic, and I'm going to argue today, non-dogmatic way, which is what makes it still relevant. One of the most important places we see this is in his discussion of the nature of the universe in Book 8 of Paradise Lost. As Colin has mentioned already, the Archangel Raphael comes down to the Garden of Eden to give Adam and Eve a lesson, to teach them about the world that they have just been born into. And one of the curious things about this lesson that Raphael gives Adam and Eve is that when he comes to talk about the nature of the universe, he hesitates between the two main ideas, the old-fashioned Aristotelian Ptolemaic idea that the Earth is the center of the universe, and the new Copernican Galilean idea that the sun is at the center of the solar system. Milton had met Galileo as a young man, seemingly was very sympathetic towards Galileo's ideas, but Raphael doesn't promote one or the other. And I think this tells us a lot about Milton's relationship to scientific truth. Instead of telling Adam that either the sun-centered or the earth-centered model is correct, Raphael says, What if the sun be centre to the world, and other stars, by his attractive virtue and their own incited, dance around him various rounds? And this means, what if Copernicus were right? What if the earth rose on the sun, just as the sun rises on the earth? And you can imagine Adam's brain exploding at this point. He's still just less than a week old. So he's not ready to be given the full cosmological lesson. He's curious. Raphael dignifies his curiosity, but he's not yet ready to be given the full truth. And I think it's striking that Milton is not so much interested in scientific fact as he is in the moral reasons behind curiosity and the moral limits on knowledge. But he gives us glimpses of what I take to be his belief in scientific truth. And the glimpses are of a recognizably modern universe. One of them appears when Satan is on his journey from hell to Eden and arrives at the edge of the universe. And I'm going to read a short passage which I think is the best argument that I have, a quote from the poem. Satan is flying through the marble air his oblique way amongst innumerable stars that shone, stars distant but nigh, hands seemed other worlds, or other worlds they seemed, or happy isles, like those Hesperian gardens famed of old, fortunate fields and groves and flowery vales, thrice happy isles, but who dwelt happy there, he stayed not to inquire. Satan is hell-bent on revenge, so he's just plummeting down towards the world and not hesitating to look at the other worlds and to think about their other inhabitants. But I suggest that in mentioning those other worlds, Milton is giving us a glimpse of the modern universe. In fact, it's not a universe, it's a multiverse that contains multiple suns, multiple solar systems. And whilst Milton is sitting on a kind of cosmological fence, not confirming one or the other view, his poem is nevertheless inseminated with this delight at the possibility of other worlds, other life forms. And in mentioning these other worlds that Satan is flying past, he's describing what modern physics calls exoplanets, which weren't actually discovered by astronomers until 1992. And in this sense, Paradise Lost is genuinely prophetic. It contains truths that Milton himself wasn't even fully in control of. And Milton acknowledges this at one point, where he pictures a spot on the sun where Satan has a breather on his way to Eden. And he says that this is a spot that no astronomer has ever seen. So he's describing how poetic thought can go beyond the most powerful technology yet invented. So the blind poet is capable of a greater sight than the most advanced scientist. And I think throughout Paradise Lost, Milton doesn't stop reminding us that knowledge, scientific knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge, should be counterbalanced with measures to stop that pursuit becoming tyrannical, to stop it being used to subjugate and deceive other people. And this is his non-dogmatic approach to truth. And this is part of his ability to inspire later readers who were not Protestant English men like himself. So this non-dogmatic poetic truth is one of the reasons that Paradise Lost was so enduring. So to conclude, I'd like to argue that Paradise Lost is still relevant today because the Darwinists have already won. And I'm not talking about the Darwin that David mentioned, nor probably the Darwin that Ruth is going to talk about. I'm not talking about the Darwin who delighted in nature, who was horrified by slavery, who loved Paradise Lost. I'm talking about the applied Darwinism of arrogant atheists, the Darwinism that uses biology to justify cultural hierarchies, that tries to convince us that the subjugation of the weak by the strong is inevitable. We need Paradise Lost today because it looks askance at nationalism and militarism because it argues that the most heroic acts are forgiveness and humility and love, because it reminds us to be suspicious about triumphalist claims of science. Bright infers not excellence, as Raphael says. Whiteness is not the same as virtue. Bigness is not necessarily best. This is a poem that the Darwinists of Silicon Valley would benefit from reading. If they did, they would find that it contains an allegory of technological progress. Towards the end of the poem, after bringing about the fall of Adam and Eve, Satan returns to hell and announces to the other devils that thanks to his great achievement, they will all be able to escape from hell, to rise up and colonize a new world. And he uses that word, colonize a new world. But instead of applause, he hears a universal hiss, because they've been all turned into snakes. Thank you.
And finally, Ruth.
Well, I want to start with the tree. The tree seems to have disappeared, but we had a very nice tree earlier. And it seems to me that the two of them have the tree in common, Milton and Darwin. Not particularly the mulberry tree back on the grass, but the tree which holds the apple of knowledge, the tree of knowledge. And of course, for Darwin, it was the tree in which he wrote out his ideas about how species mutate and generations happen. And he very modestly put on the side, going upwards, "I think." And that was very characteristic of him, that he was trying something out. He wasn't dogmatic. But anyway, the tree. These are two sorts of ways of knowledge, and I think we desperately need them both. Both the poetry, and of course I'm arguing against myself here, but poetry gives you a sense, expands and enriches your sense of the possible, morally, emotionally, sonically, aesthetically. It gives you something to see beyond, the word that has come up in several of our talks. But we also desperately need science, not the science of the devotees of the Silicon Valley, but scientia, which is knowing, from scire, to know, and how you know. You go towards it. You have to have proof. And in this age of disinformation, this terrifying new dark age of disinformation, we need standards of knowing. And I think that's one important little apple to keep on the tree. So although my heart is with Milton, so from the root springs lighter the green stalk, evolution is the foundation of biology. You can't have biology, you can't understand biology without it. And you can't have advances in medicine. The advances, the extraordinary rapid way that the vaccines of COVID were made is partly because of understanding how evolution happens, how viruses evolve and so on. So we need what he stood for, what he explored. And I also want to have a bit of personality in here too, not to the gun-toting undergraduate. And actually, he gave up guns later in life, I do have to say. He thought they were cruel. But somebody who was always thinking about people. And he said something. I want to read a few things that they're my own bits of things, but they quote him. And first of all, I want to put in his self-deprecation, which David has mentioned, and his humor. He laughed at himself. So here he is in 1838. He's a young man. He has seen, before he was 30, how evolution could happen. It was an extraordinary, he kept quiet about it. It was a devastating thing for a young man to think. And then he started on a series of proof for it. And then he thought he'd like to do a spot of natural selection himself. And he thought he ought to get married. He was living by now in London after he'd come back from the Beagle. And he put it in terms, as I've put it, as a balance sheet against freedom to go where I please, conversation of clever men in clubs, choice of society and little of it, no one to interfere with solitude I need, not forced to visit relatives or bend in every trifle. Whoever she is might hate London. Children are anxiety, responsibility, expense. Not so much money for books. There could be misrule in the house, quarrelling even. Banished to country, unable to read in the evening, becoming a fat, indolent fool. Eheu. God knows why he said eheu. He wasn't particularly fond of Latin. He just said eheu, which means alas in Latin. Eheu. I should never know French. See America. Go up in a balloon. But no children, no second life, no one to care about me in old age. Why continue working all day with no sympathy from near and dear? 4. A constant companion and friend in old age. An object to be loved and played with. Better than dog. Children, if it please God. A home and someone to care for it. Female chat, good for one's health. Charm of music, perhaps. Terrible loss of my time. But my God, picture a whole life spent like a neuter bee, working in smoke and grime of a London house all day alone. Then think of a nice, soft wife on a sofa, looking at me with a good fire and books. Look at dingy Great Marlborough Street. Marry, 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 QED. So I've just shaped that a little bit, but those are all his words. And you can see how there's a sparkle of humor, self-deprecating, aware of the time, aware of all the resonances we've just laughed at, even in something that he really, really needed to do. So that's the sort of the humorous aspect. And as he and his wife went on, he married his first cousin, and she was very... he knew her, he'd known her all her life, and they were very fond of each other, and it was a very strong marriage. It was very tested by the death, aged 10, of their first child, their beloved little Annie. And that could have made a huge gulf between them, because Emma felt that they would see her again in heaven. And for Charles, he couldn't possibly feel that. And it was, in fact, the loss of Annie that tipped him over. That was when he really started writing, realizing that he never used that phrase, but the survival of the fittest. He felt that the weak will go to the wall. There's a chapter in The Origin of Species, which is really heartfelt and painful about the weak go to the wall. And he was thinking of Annie. But they didn't let it divide them. And in fact, I wanted to read you one more thing, which is from him and a little bit from her. Before she had the first baby, she knew that people died in childbirth. There wasn't yet any chloroform in childbirth. She was facing what she didn't know. She didn't go out. She had bad back. And one of the things that was happening at this period was that the men were reading geology. They were reading all sorts of things which were querying things in the Bible. It wasn't necessarily querying the articles of faith, but it was querying what was written in the Bible and the current interpretation of the Bible at the time, of the flood and all the rest of it. And so the men were starting to disbelieve a lot of things about the Christian faith as it was then, and the women often were not. And she wrote this heartfelt little note to him, which is still there in the papers, saying, I wish that you could, I wish just that you could read what Jesus says to his disciples before Gethsemane. And I don't wish you to tell me anything about it. I just wished you to read it, because I'm not worried about now. I'm worried about the future. Her idea was as if she died, and she would probably, the betting was she would go to heaven with any luck. But Darwin, as an atheist or as an agnostic, might not, and so they would be divided. That was what her biggest worry was, and she put that in this letter. And we have on the we don't know what he said at the time, but he left a little message on her note, which he kept all his life. And he must have said something then, but he wrote on the outer fold of this. No one knows when. I mean, he knew where his thoughts were going. He knew what she thought of them. He shared. It was a deeply intellectual and sharing marriage. And he just put on this fold, and she found it. When I am dead, know I have kissed and cried over this many times. So there was that sadness, but also a sort of humor and compassion at the center of his life. I don't know why I've got into this. I'm sorry that I didn't. I've gone away from Paradise Lost. He took Paradise Lost with him on the Journey of the Beagle. My grandmother edited his Voyage of the Beagle, and she does put. She didn't go to church. She put in the introduction. No one. He also took the Greek New Testament, and she put. No one knows if he opened that. But he took, whenever they got off the boat and they went for land expeditions, he would slip Paradise Lost into his pocket. And there's a lovely moment when they're leaving Brazil, and in his voyage of the Beagle, and he says he sees it. He adored the jungles. He got so excited. He was a young man. He was 22, and he was seeing. It was riches of a natural curiosity and wonder in these jungles of Brazil, which later on he said that was where he most felt the feeling of the sublime was in the forests. And but he couldn't bear Brazil because the slave culture. He saw slaves who'd been tortured, slaves who were afraid of their masters. He was sickened. This was just in 1832, just as they were setting sail from Portsmouth. He kept writing to his sisters what's happening about the Reform Bill. The first Reform Bill was going. He was a Democrat. He wanted franchise for everybody. But anyway, they got on the boat. He's sad to leave the forests. He's going off into the unknown. It's dark. Little tossing boat, and the night pitch dark, he said, the whole sea luminous, every part of water which by day is seen as foam glowed with pale light. The vessel drove before her bows 2 billows of liquid phosphorus. Her wake was a milky train. As far as the eye reached, the crest of every wave was bright, and from the reflected light the sky just above horizon not so utterly dark as the rest of the heavens. Impossible to behold this plain of matter, as it were melted and consumed by heat, without remembering Milton. And I think, but I might be corrected, it's probably from book 1. Through the gloom was seen 10,000 banners rise into the air with orient colours waving. But there might be other passages. And I think we ought to remember that the origin of species follows the arc of Paradise Lost. Because you have to have a fall, you have to have deaths and all these dinosaurs smokily going into the distance in order to have the new developing life. So for love, for humanity, for family and humour, for having discovered evolution, which is the basis of biology and on which we're depending now, for standing up in a very modest and humane way for science on which we all depend, and for its proof of our knowledge. And if you don't have that proof, you have to go on till you find a new theory and a better proof. I vote for Darwin.
Wow, thank you very much, everybody. What fabulous, rich, exciting speeches we've had. An object lesson in the difference between writing it down and making it up. So Milton and Darwin. We have a little time which is reserved for responses and ripostes from our panellists to one another, if they would like to take us up on this time. So maybe about like 45 to 60 seconds each. Anything burning that you have to say that you want to say in response. After that point, we will ask for any contributions from the audience. So if you have an intervention, ideally concise and decisive, we would like to hear it from you, or a question or an observation. There'll be a few minutes at the end. We're aiming to wrap up by about 6:45, but we may run over by a couple of minutes if that's all right. Obviously, head for the exits if it's not okay. So may I ask, first of all, Team Milton, whether they have anything they would like to say to the cogent arguments put forward by Team Darwin.
Responding first to Ruth and then a question for either one of you. It seems to be the case that in the Victorian period, it was impossible for a certain class of person to even see nature without thinking about Milton, and that his work was so pervasive that it was inevitable that Darwin would think of him. And he did think of him in Montevideo when he saw a toad that he said was fit to squat close at the ear of Eve, which was a quote from Milton. But elsewhere in his work describing the forest as sublime, Milton had done so much to define the sublime that it's not even when he's quoting Darwin that he's present, that Darwin is quoting him. My question for either you or David is if Darwin is such a humane person, why was it that he ended up defending the inferiority of both women and certain races in The Descent of Man?
Darwin might, David might. I mean, he, you say humane person. Well, he was humane in his life.
But not in his writing.
Well, in most of his writing, he was. I mean, the letters, the whole correspondence project. I don't know if any of you know this really exemplary and wonderful stash of letters that have been put online meticulously for the last sort of 20 years. And it just breathes humanity. Yes. He got pushed around in The Descent of Man. I don't know, David knows much more about this. Perhaps. Maybe he doesn't.
I think The Descent of Man was the book that he was most reluctant to write, because it would, if taken literally, could be misinterpreted because of the way in which the way in which natural selection might be viewed, and was viewed by people much later, such as Francis Galton, in terms of racist perspectives on the inevitable exaggerated interpretation of where Darwinian natural selection goes. So I can see his reluctance and his difficulty when he was dealing with the Patagonian natives. He was seeing a version of mankind that was having to deal with the most harsh environments and were living under extremely difficult conditions compared to those that had to be endured by those living in the rich north from which he had come. So I think that there's an element of him being torn between the literal interpretation of natural selection and the way in which you might extrapolate that into the mankind and the races of mankind, which was, I think, in a sense, he could anticipate the corruption of the way his views could be developed in time, and indeed were. which is a great shame. So that's unfortunate. The sublime, certainly in relation to his experiences with tropical rainforests, was undoubted. But he was also deeply pragmatic. To moving away from the sublimity, they passed Cape Verde Islands. And the Cape Verde Islands, he noticed that the beaches, which had existed at sea level, were up in the cliff. And he found seashells indicating where the shore used to be. Question, has the sea dropped or has the island risen? Has the land risen? I don't know, but it's a volcanic island. Maybe the volcano pushed up and left the seashore behind? Question, I don't know. Went to South America, followed the coast down there, measured raised seashores down the entire length of the continent. On that basis of the differential measurements, he then figured out that the whole of the continent had been tilted. And he could then figure out, he knew that just off the coast of Chile, there was a power that was shifting an entire continent. That, I think, is remarkable. And that's where there's the emotional sublimity associated with the sheer productivity of nature. And then this other rational being that's measuring the height of old seashores and figuring out that an entire continent, how on earth did that happen? He didn't know. We now know. But the observations, the inductions that led to, there's a machinery that works the earth. I don't know what it is, but it's working the earth. It's remarkable.
I think what they both have in common, apart from that tree, or two trees, is curiosity. And that the curiosity is wonderful. And when he said at one point, the grand question, putting a capital G and a capital Q, which every naturalist ought to have before him when dissecting a whale or classifying a mite or a fungus, is, what are the laws of life? And it seems to me that both these men were interested in that. And toads and all.
I'd just like to say one thing, following on from what you were saying about the Darwinists in Silicon Valley. It's a dangerous game to blame people for their offspring. I speak as a father, you know. You know, if you got into that game, you look at all those dreadful 18th century poets who thought they were imitating Milton, who just wrote terrible, terrible verse. But Darwin, I think, did leave a door wide open to his heirs to see the world as one big battle for mastery. You know, the phrase, the battle for life, is his phrase, and it's a phrase he uses repeatedly. And The Origin of Species is a magnificent work. His powers of observation were extraordinary. His ability to fuse together geology, geography, you know, all of that, absolutely amazing. But he wasn't very good at metaphors, and he left a whole legacy of strife embedded in the vision of the world that he so influentially created. And that is a tremendously damaging legacy, actually. And if he'd read more Milton and read it better, his metaphors would have been better. That's all I have to say.
But there does seem to be a certain amount of strife in Milton too.
Yes. It's my fault. I didn't explain what quickfire was, did I? I take full responsibility, but I can already see people bolting for the exits. And I think that means that we sadly don't have time for official questions, but everybody will be around in the drinks afterwards, I think, to take your questions and to talk about this exciting thing once more. So there are two things that remain to be done. One is to take another vote. Now, I was at the Panto at Christmas, and I saw this brilliant thing, and I think we should try it. And it's basically, all at once, you've got to shout for what you want. So if you're a Miltonist, you have to shout poetry, and if you're for Darwin, you can shout evolution, and we'll at the same time, and we'll decide which is louder, and from that we will decide intellectually and with great precision and delicacy who has won. So on the count of three, don't you do? On the count of three, I'll pretend that didn't happen. Shout for who you like. So 1, 2, 3. Well, I think that's clear. I'd also like, please, to thank our speakers who've put in so much time, given us wonderful things to think about, and to Katie Mennis, who has organised this brilliant occasion. Thanks very much.